The lights flickered overhead, a constant, irritating rhythm that matched the irregular beeping from the irrigation console. Stu Halvath rubbed his temples, squinting at the readouts that only confirmed what he already knew. Biodome 14 on Virella 3 was failing, just like the 13 before it. Through the reinforced composite windows, the wasteland stretched toward the horizon, a cruel, freezing expanse of purplish rock and ice crystals that glittered beneath the distant sun. Inside, row upon row of withering crops fought for life, their leaves browning at the edges despite the carefully controlled environment. Adjustment complete, Stu muttered to himself, punching in the final command. He was talking more these days, if only to hear a human voice. Most of the staff had evacuated during the Great Recall, when Earth had decided that Virella 3 was no longer cost-effective for terraforming. Only essential personnel remained. And essential had been defined with cold precision by administrators who would never set foot on this frozen rock. Stu's footsteps echoed as he walked the central corridor of Biodome 14. 6 months since the last transport left. 6 months of solitude, broken only by automated status reports and the occasional directive from Earth. His job was simple: maintain minimum viable production until the final decision was made, whether to abandon the biodome entirely or repurpose it for something else. He paused at the viewport, gazing at the failing Vinorn crop, a heartier version of Earth corn, spliced with virulent fungal DNA. The plants were resilient, but even they were struggling now. Resources were being rationed: power for heating, water for irrigation, nutrients for the soil, all calibrated to sustain rather than thrive. A movement caught his eye, out among the dying fields, where nothing should be moving. Stu blinked, certain his isolation was finally causing hallucinations. But there it was again, shadows shifting between the rows of withered plants. Not one shadow, but 3. The security protocols were clear: no unauthorized personnel. Virella 3 was officially closed to civilians. But as Stu peered through the viewport, his breath fogging the transparent surface, he saw them more clearly. Humanoid figures, stumbling rather than walking, making their way toward the biodome's entrance. Against every regulation, against 6 months of disciplined adherence to protocol, Stu found himself moving toward the airlock. He activated the external cameras as he went, and the image on the small monitor stopped him cold. A woman, her purple-tinged skin a sign of extended exposure to Virella's atmosphere, clutched the hands of 2 small children. Even through the grainy footage, he could see they were emaciated, their clothes hanging from thin frames. The woman's eyes, when she looked up at the camera, held a desperate plea. Her lips moved, and Stu activated the external audio. "Please," her voice crackled through the speakers. "My children are hungry. I'll work your fields, warm your bed. Just feed my starving kids." The protocols said to activate security, to alert Earth Command, to let the automated defense systems handle the intrusion. But Stu's finger hovered over the communication panel, and he found himself unable to press the alert button. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in 6 months. He overrode the security lockdown and opened the external airlock door. The woman flinched when the massive door began to slide open, pulling her children behind her in a protective gesture. But the bitter cold of Virella 3's atmosphere left her no choice. She shepherded the children forward into the decontamination chamber. Stu watched through the internal cameras as the fine mist of disinfectant sprayed down on them. The woman closed her eyes, her arms wrapped around the children. They looked so small, so vulnerable under the harsh, white lights. When the inner door opened, Stu was waiting. The woman's eyes widened at the sight of him, a mixture of hope and wariness. Up close, he could see the purple tinge to her skin wasn't just from exposure. She had the distinctive markings of a virulent, adapted human, one of the early colonists whose DNA had been modified to better survive the planet's harsh conditions. "You shouldn't be here," Stu said, but there was no force behind his words. The colony was evacuated. All civilians were supposed to leave. The woman's eyes hardened. Not all of us had somewhere to go. Her voice was raspy, as though she hadn't used it in a long time. Some of us were forgotten. The smaller of the two children, a girl no more than 5 or 6, peered around her mother's legs. Her eyes were large, sunken into a face too thin for her age. But they held a spark of curiosity that tugged at something deep inside Stu. "I'm Mari," the woman said, straightening her shoulders despite her obvious exhaustion. "These are my children, Lena and Yari." The boy, slightly older than his sister, kept his eyes downcast, one hand clutching his mother's tattered jacket. Stu noticed how his other hand protectively covered his abdomen, a gesture of chronic hunger he recognized from the historical footage of Earth's darkest periods. "I'm Stu Halvath," he replied, suddenly aware of how disheveled he must look after months of solitary work. I'm not supposed to let anyone in." Mari's face hardened further. "Then why did you open the door?" It was a fair question, one Stu didn't have an immediate answer for. Instead, he gestured toward the corridor. "Medical bay is this way. You all need to be checked." Relief flashed across Mari's face, quickly hidden behind a mask of caution. "And then?" Stu couldn't meet her eyes. "I don't know yet." The medical bay, like everything else in Biodome 14, was designed for efficiency rather than comfort. The automated diagnostic system hummed to life as Stu activated it, green scanning lights passing over each of them in turn. Malnutrition, dehydration, minor respiratory inflammation from atmospheric exposure. The system's flat voice reported, "Recommended treatment, nutrient therapy, hydration, rest." Stu watched as Mari helped her children onto the examination tables, her movements gentle despite her own obvious exhaustion. "The system will administer basic treatments," he explained, "but I can get you food while it works." For the first time, a genuine emotion crossed Mari's face. Hope, tinged with suspicion. "Real food? Not synthetic protein?" Stu nodded. "The Biodome still produces enough for one person. More than enough." Actually, he didn't mention that he'd been storing the surplus, against regulations, unable to let even withered crops go to waste when they could be preserved. When he returned with a tray of simple foods, hydroponically grown vegetables, cultured protein, and purified water, the children's eyes widened. Lena, the little girl, reached out her hand, then quickly withdrew it, looking to her mother for permission. "Slowly," Mari cautioned as she nodded. "Small bites, your stomachs aren't used to it." Stu watched them eat, feeling something uncoil within him, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. There was something profoundly right about seeing the food he'd tended going to actual use, nourishing these hungry children instead of being measured and reported in sterile production metrics. "How long have you been out there?" he asked Mari, who was carefully portioning the food, ensuring her children ate first. "Since the evacuation order," she replied, her voice low. "We were at Biodome 7 when it happened. I was an agricultural engineer there." Stu's brow furrowed. "But all personnel was supposed to be accounted for." A bitter smile touched Mari's lips. "My contract had just expired. I was classified as non-essential, but the transport fees back to Earth," she shook her head. "We couldn't afford them. Not on what they paid us. And Lena and Yari were born here. They don't have Earth citizenship." The injustice of it struck Stu like a physical blow. He'd heard rumors, of course, about colonists stranded by technicalities and corporate fine print. But facing the reality of it, these hungry children, this desperate mother, made his years of obedient service suddenly seem hollow. A soft beeping from his wrist communicator shattered the moment. "Security scan in progress," the automated voice announced. "All personnel to designated stations." Mari's head snapped up, fear replacing the momentary calm. "What does that mean?" Stu was already moving. heart pounding. It means we have a problem. The system does regular sweeps for unauthorized life signs. He grabbed a medical blanket, tossing it to Mari. Cover yourselves with these. The thermal material might confuse the senses. Might? Mari's voice was tight as she quickly wrapped Lena in the blanket. It's all we've got, Stu replied, helping her with Yari. Stay here. Don't move. I'll try to override the scan from the control room. He was at the door when Mari's voice stopped him. Why are you helping us? The question held genuine confusion, as though kindness was something she no longer expected from the world. Stu hesitated. Because it's the right thing to do, the words felt strange in his mouth. Simple yet profound, a truth he'd somehow forgotten during his years of following orders. The corridors seemed longer as Stu hurried toward the control room, every shadow potentially hiding a security drone. The sweeps were supposed to be random, impossible to predict, a measure to ensure compliance even among isolated staff. Stu had never resented them before, had, in fact, found comfort in their regularity. A reminder that systems were still functioning as designed. Now, each step was weighted with fear, not for himself, but for the 3 vulnerable lives hidden in his medical bay. The control room doors slid open, recognizing his biometric signature. Inside, the main console was already flashing warning indicators. Stu's fingers flew across the interface, calling up the security parameters. Override security sweep, he commanded, inputting his authorization code. Override denied. The system replied. Level 3 authorization required. Stu swore under his breath. His authorization was only level 2, enough to handle day-to-day operations, not enough to cancel security protocols. He'd never needed higher clearance before. Compliance had always been easier than resistance. The monitor showed the sweep pattern. Automated drones, already deployed from their charging stations, methodically moving through the biodome sectors. They would reach the medical bay in approximately 12 minutes. 12 minutes to find a solution, or Mari and her children would be discovered, reported, and Stu didn't even want to imagine what would happen. Deportation was the best-case scenario, but to where? There were no more civilian transports running to Varela 3. His mind raced through options, discarding each as quickly as it formed. Destroying the drones would trigger an immediate emergency response. Trying to move Mari and the children would expose them to the sensors. Hiding them somewhere else in the biodome would only delay the inevitable. Then his eyes fell on the environmental controls. Not the security systems, those were locked down tight, but the biodome's basic life support functions, which were still under his control. A desperate plan formed, risky, potentially catastrophic if it went wrong, but it was their only chance. Stu's fingers danced across the console, programming a specific sequence of events. First, a gradual reduction in temperature in all sectors except the medical bay. Then, a subtle redistribution of power, nothing that would trigger alarms, just enough to create misleading heat signatures throughout the biodome. Finally, the most dangerous part, a controlled shutdown of the lighting systems in a wave pattern, creating the illusion of a minor power fluctuation moving through the facility. If he timed it right, the security drones would follow the pattern, investigating the anomaly instead of completing their normal sweep pattern. If he timed it wrong, well, they'd all find out what happened to those who violated Earth Command's protocols. With a deep breath, Stu executed the sequence. The lights in the control room dimmed immediately, plunging the space into a twilight state illuminated only by the glow of emergency indicators. On the monitors, Stu watched as the wave of darkness spread outward, sector by sector. The temperature readings began to shift, creating a pattern of heat signatures that mimicked human movement, a distraction, a decoy to pull the drones away from the medical bay. On the security feed, the drones paused in their predetermined paths, their sensors detecting the changes. For an agonizing moment, they hovered in place, analyzing the new data. Then, one by one, They changed course, following the false trail Stu had created. Stu allowed himself a moment of hope, then froze as an alert flashed across his screen. Anomalous biosignatures detected. Sector 5, the medical bay. One of the drones had registered the presence of Mari and her children before being diverted. Now it was returning to investigate, breaking from the pack to follow its primary programming. Stu didn't hesitate. He locked down the control room console, ensuring his manipulations couldn't be easily detected, and sprinted back toward the medical bay. If he couldn't prevent the drone from finding them, he would at least be there to face the consequences alongside them. The corridors were dim, emergency lighting casting long shadows as he ran. Behind him, he could hear the faint whir of a drone in pursuit, whether tracking him or simply following its programming to the medical bay. He couldn't tell. He burst through the medical bay doors to find Mari standing protectively in front of her children, a surgical implement clutched in her hand like a weapon. "Drone coming," Stu gasped. "No time to explain. Trust me." Mari's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded once, decisively. "Under the diagnostic table," Stu directed, already moving to help them. "The drone's sensors can't penetrate the lead shielding." As Mari quickly ushered her children into the cramped space beneath the examination table, Stu grabbed a medical scanner and adjusted its settings to maximum output. "What are you doing?" Mari whispered, pulling Lena close to her chest as they huddled in their hiding place. "Creating interference," Stu replied, activating the scanner just as the medical bay doors slid open. The security drone hovered in the entrance, its sensors sweeping the room in methodical patterns. Stu stood perfectly still, the humming medical scanner in his hand, sending out waves of disruptive energy. The drone paused, its programming momentarily confused by the conflicting signals. It advanced slowly into the room, focusing its sensors on Stu. "Identification," it demanded, its mechanized voice echoing in the quiet space. "Stu Halvath, agricultural technician, ID 47293, Stu responded, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Conducting routine maintenance on medical equipment." The drone hovered closer, its sensors still active. "Additional biosignatures detected." Stu's heart pounded, but he kept his expression neutral. "Running biological simulations for crop enhancement. Authorized procedure." The drone processed this information, its lights blinking as it cross-referenced his explanation with its programming parameters. Stu held his breath, acutely aware of Mari and her children hidden just meters away, their lives hanging on whether a machine could be convinced to see past its rigid instructions. "Procedure not in scheduled database." The drone finally responded, transmitting report to Earth Command for verification. Cold dread washed over Stu. A direct communication to Earth Command would reveal everything. There would be no hiding Mari and her children then, no protecting them from whatever punishment the system decided was appropriate for unauthorized persons. In that moment, Stu made a decision that would change everything. "Override Protocol Epsilon 9, he said clearly, using a command phrase he'd never thought he'd need, one that had been impressed upon all technicians during their training as an absolute last resort. The drone froze in place, its lights shifting from blue to red. "Override Protocol Epsilon 9 acknowledged. Warning, this protocol will initiate full system reset. All security measures will be temporarily disabled. Confirmation required." Stu looked directly into the drone's optical sensor. "Confirmed." The drone's lights flashed rapidly, then went dark. It dropped to the floor with a metallic clang, all systems shutting down as the emergency override took effect. For a moment, the medical bay was silent except for the sound of their breathing. Then, from beneath the table, Yari whispered, "Is it dead?" Stu crouched down, meeting the boy's frightened eyes. "Not dead, just sleeping, but it won't stay that way for long." He helped Mari and the children out from their hiding place. We have maybe 15 minutes before the system reboots and reports the override. Mari stood, brushing dust from her children's clothes with shaking hands. What happens then? Then, every security protocol in the biodome activates, Stu said grimly. And I lose all ability to help you. Mari's face hardened with determination. So we have 15 minutes to disappear. It wasn't a question. Stu shook his head. No, we have 15 minutes to change the rules. The central computer core of Biodome 14 was located deep within the structure, protected by multiple security measures. Under normal circumstances, Stu would never have been able to access it, but with the security system temporarily disabled by the override, the doors opened at his approach. Mari followed close behind, her children clutching her hands. What are we doing here? She asked, eyeing the banks of servers and blinking lights with the practiced assessment of an engineer. Rewriting history, Stu replied, connecting his personal tablet to the main console. Or at least, rewriting your status. His fingers flew across the interface, navigating through layers of administrative protocols. Every person on Virella 3 was classified before the evacuation, he explained as he worked. Essential or non-essential. Those categories determined everything: who stayed, who left, who received resources. Mari's expression darkened. I know. My family fell through the cracks between categories. Stu nodded grimly. But the system is still active, still categorizing and allocating based on those initial parameters. He pulled up a file, his own personnel record, showing his essential status. If I can change your designation in the system, we'd be legitimate. Mari finished, sudden hope lighting her features. We'd have a right to be here. Exactly. Stu created new personnel files, entering Mari's details first. Agricultural engineer, essential personnel retained for biodome sustainability initiatives. Mari watched over his shoulder, pointing out fields he'd missed. Add my specialization in adaptive hybridization. That would justify keeping me here after the evacuation. Next came the children. Stu hesitated over their classification, then entered them as dependents of essential personnel, authorized for resource allocation under Directive 87. The minutes ticked by, each one bringing them closer to the system reboot. Stu's hands were steady, but sweat beaded on his forehead as he integrated the new files into the main database, carefully backdating them to before the evacuation orders. Almost done, he murmured, initiating the final verification sequence. Once this completes, you'll be officially recognized. The system will allocate resources for you, include you in all reports to Earth Command. A harsh alarm cut him off, red lights pulsing through the room. System reboot in progress, an automated voice announced. All unauthorized access will be terminated. Mari grabbed Stu's arm. Is it done? Did it work? Stu stared at the progress bar on the screen. 97% complete. Not yet. We need another minute. But they didn't have another minute. Throughout the biodome, systems were coming back online, security protocols reactivating. The drone in the medical bay would be rebooting, its memory intact, its report of the override ready to transmit. What happens if it doesn't finish? Lena asked, her small voice somehow carrying over the alarms. Stu looked down at the child, her face pale with fear, yet still holding that spark of curiosity that had first touched his heart. In that moment, he knew he couldn't fail her. It will finish, he promised, but I need to give it time. He disconnected his tablet, handing it to Mari. Take this. The process will complete automatically if the connection isn't interrupted. Mari's eyes widened in understanding. What are you going to do? Create a diversion. Stu was already moving toward the door. Keep the children here until the alarms stop. Then go to Residential Pod 3. It's configured for a family unit. The system will recognize you as authorized personnel by then. Stu! Mari called after him, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. He paused in the doorway, looking back at this improvised family that had somehow become so important to him in just a few hours. Stay safe. Grow things. Make this place live again. Then he was gone, racing through the corridors toward the security hub, where all reports were processed before being transmitted to Earth Command. If he could delay the drone's report, give the system update time to complete. The security hub doors were locked, the system reboot having restored normal protocols. Stu swiped his access card, but a red light flashed. Access denied. Security containment in progress. Through the small window in the door, Stu could see the central console, where report logs were queuing for transmission. The drone's report would be among them, flagged as high priority. There was only one way to stop it now. Stu made his way to the environmental control station, a secondary system, less secured than the main controls. From here, he could access the biodome's basic functions: temperature, atmosphere, lighting, and power distribution. With quick, decisive movements, Stu rerouted power away from the security hub, initiating an emergency conservation protocol that would, coincidentally, cut all outgoing communications for several critical minutes. The effect was immediate. Throughout the biodome, non-essential systems powered down, lights dimmed, and the constant background hum of machinery quieted to a whisper. In that artificial twilight, Stu made his way back toward the computer core, hoping that Mari and her children were safe, that the system update had completed, that his desperate gamble had worked. He never made it there. Halfway down the main corridor, a security drone intercepted him, its lights pulsing red in the dimness. Behind it, 2 more drones appeared, forming a blockade. "Stuart Halvath," the lead drone announced. "You are detained pending investigation for violation of security protocols and unauthorized system manipulation." Stu straightened his shoulders, facing the machines with a calmness that surprised even him. On whose authority? Earth Command. Response to emergency override. All personnel to be confined until situation assessment complete. So they didn't know about Mari and the children yet. The report hadn't gone through. There was still hope. "I'll comply," Stu said, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Take me to the detention area." The detention area of Biodome 14 was hardly more than a reinforced storage room, repurposed for the rare occasions when a staff member needed to be isolated, usually for medical quarantine rather than punishment. Stu sat on the narrow cot, listening to the sounds of the biodome through the walls, the cycling of air filters, the distant hum of irrigation pumps, the occasional ping of a drone passing by on patrol. Hours passed. No one came to question him. No communication arrived from Earth Command. The biodome's automated systems simply continued their functions, treating his detention as another parameter to be managed. Stu used the time to think, to plan what he would say when the questions finally came. He would take full responsibility. He would explain that he had acted alone, that Mari and her children had been desperate, seeking shelter. Perhaps there would be leniency, though he doubted it. Earth Command had been clear about the evacuation protocols. Night cycle came, the biodome's lighting dimming to simulate darkness. Stu lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Mari had found residential pod 3, if the children were sleeping in real beds for the first time in months. He must have dozed off, because the sound of the door sliding open startled him awake. He sat up, expecting to see security drones or perhaps a communication screen with an Earth Command official. Instead, Mari stood in the doorway, a portable tablet in her hand. "How?" Stu began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "Official agricultural engineer, remember?" She held up the tablet, showing her newly minted credentials. "The system recognizes me now. I have access to all areas, including this one." Stu stood, hardly daring to believe it had worked. "The children?" A smile touched Mari's lips. transforming her tired face. Asleep, in real beds, with full stomachs. She stepped into the room, the door sliding closed behind her. Your plan worked. Stu, the system accepted our files before the security reboot completed, as far as Earth Command knows. We've been here all along. Essential personnel retained after the evacuation. Relief flooded through Stu, making his knees weak. He sank back onto the cot. And my detention? Mari's smile faded. That's the one problem. The override was logged. Someone has to take responsibility for it. She sat beside him, her shoulder just touching his. The system is waiting for Earth Command's response. How long? Communication delays being what they are. 3 days, maybe 4. Stu nodded slowly. 3 days was nothing compared to the months of solitude he'd already endured. And this time, the waiting had purpose. It was protecting Mari and her children, giving them a chance. I can handle 3 days, he said. Mari studied his face, her eyes searching. You barely know us, she said softly. Why risk everything like this? Stu considered the question, looking past her to the blank wall of the detention room. Before you arrived, I was just maintaining, keeping systems running, filing reports, waiting for decisions to be made by people who would never set foot on this planet. He met her gaze. You reminded me that there's more to life than following protocols. Mari's hand found his, her fingers cool against his skin. Thank you, she whispered. Not just for helping us, but for seeing us as people worth helping. The simple touch, the first human contact Stu had experienced in months, sent a wave of emotion through him that he couldn't quite name. For so long, he'd been defined by his function, agricultural technician, ID 47293, a cog in the vast machinery of Earth Command's colonization efforts. Now, with this small family depending on him, he was becoming something else, something more. I should go, Mari said, rising. The children will wake soon, but I'll bring you food, and news from Earth Command when it comes. Stu nodded, already feeling the isolation of the detention room closing in again as she moved toward the door. Mari, he called after her. Be careful. The drones are still active, still monitoring. She paused, looking back at him with an expression that mingled determination and something softer, something that might, in time, grow into affection. We will be. Rest now. You've done enough. The door slid closed behind her, leaving Stu alone with his thoughts and the soft sounds of the biodome continuing its endless cycles of life support. The response from Earth Command came on the 3rd day. Stu was dozing on the cot when the detention room door slid open. He sat up, instantly alert, expecting to see Mari. Instead, a security drone hovered in the doorway, its optical sensors focused on him. Stuart Halvath, it announced. Your presence is required in the communication center. Stu stood, his heart racing. This was it, Earth Command's judgment. He followed the drone through the corridors, noting the subtle changes in the biodome since his detention. Someone, Mari, he assumed, had adjusted the lighting in the agricultural sectors, optimizing it for the failing crops. Already, there was a greener tint to the plants he could see through the internal windows. The communication center was small, dominated by the large screen used for direct transmissions from Earth. The screen was active when Stu entered, but instead of the stern face of an Earth Command official, it displayed only a text message. Regarding security override, Protocol Epsilon 9 location, Biodome, 14 Virella. 3 Technician, Halvath. Stuart, ID 47293. Review complete. Override justified under emergency maintenance protocols. Detention terminated. Addendum. Personnel review indicates Biodome. 14 understaffed for current operations. Agricultural Engineer Mari, ID 82175. and dependents confirmed as essential personnel. Resource allocations adjusted accordingly. Status of Biodome. 14 reclassified to Humanitarian Settlement Zone under Directive 113, continue agricultural operations with expanded focus on sustainable habitation. Next communication scheduled 30 days. Stu read the message twice, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. Not only had his actions been accepted, but Mari and her children had been officially recognized, and the biodome itself reclassified in a way that would protect them all. "Accepted," he said aloud, authorizing the message receipt. The screen went dark, the communication complete. For a moment, Stu stood in the silent room, processing what had happened. Then he was moving, racing through the corridors toward Residential Pod 3, needing to share this miracle with the only other people in the biodome. He found them in the small hydroponics lab adjacent to the residential section. Mari was kneeling beside a tray of seedlings, Lena and Yari watching intently as she demonstrated how to check the soil moisture. "Not too wet," she was saying, "or the roots will rot. Not too dry, or they'll wither." She looked up as Stu appeared in the doorway, her face lighting with surprise and pleasure. "Stu, you're out!" The children turned at their mother's exclamation, Lena immediately running to Stu with an excitement that caught him off guard. She wrapped her arms around his legs, looking up at him with a gap-toothed smile. "Dr. Stu, did you see our plants? We're growing food." Stu crouched down to her level, his throat tight with emotion. "I see them. They're going to be wonderful." Yari approached more cautiously, but his face held a new openness, the wariness gradually giving way to trust. "Mom says you're not in trouble anymore." "That's right," Stu confirmed, looking past the children to Mari, whose eyes were asking the question she wouldn't voice in front of the kids. "Earth Command approved everything. The override, your status here, and they've reclassified the biodome." Mari's eyebrows rose. "Reclassified? To what?" "A humanitarian settlement zone," Stu said, still hardly believing it himself. "They've increased our resource allocations. We're officially authorized to focus on sustainable habitation." Mari's hand went to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "They're letting us stay, truly stay." Stu nodded, his own vision blurring. It seems someone at Earth Command still remembers what these colonies were supposed to be about in the first place. Not just resource extraction, but creating new homes for humanity. Lena tugged at his hand, her face serious. "Does this mean we don't have to hide anymore?" "That's right," Stu assured her, gently squeezing her small fingers. "This is your home now, officially. And you'll stay too?" The question came from Yari, his voice soft but steady. Stu looked at the boy, then at Mari, seeing in her expression the same question, the same hope. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll stay too." In the months that followed, Biodome, 14 transformed. With the increased resource allocations, the failing crops recovered, and new varieties were planted. Mari's expertise in adaptive hybridization proved invaluable, creating strains that thrived in the specific conditions of their environment. The residential section, once a sterile collection of individual pods, became a true living space. Walls were repurposed, communal areas created. Lena and Yari's artwork, bright, hopeful splashes of color created with pigments extracted from plants, decorated surfaces that had once been institutional gray. Other changes were more subtle. The security drones, their programming updated under the new classification, became helpful assistants rather than watchful guards. The constant security sweeps gave way to maintenance checks and resource management. And perhaps the most profound change was in Stu himself. The solitary technician who had merely maintained systems was now part of something living and growing, not just the plants in the biodome, but the small family that had claimed him as their own. One evening, as the light cycle dimmed to simulate sunset, Stu stood at the main viewport, watching Mari working in the fields below. The vineyard crop was flourishing now, tall stalks heavy with grain that would soon be harvested. Near the edge of the field, Lena and Yari were collecting samples for their ongoing project, documenting every living thing in the biodome, creating a catalogue of their world. Mari looked up, somehow sensing his gaze. Even at a distance, he could see her smile, could feel the connection between them that had grown alongside the crops they tended. She raised a hand in greeting, and he returned the gesture, a simple acknowledgement of everything they had built together. In that moment, Stu realized that Biodome 14, once just another failing experiment on a hostile world, had become something Earth Command had never intended. A home, not just a place to work or survive, but a place to live, to grow, to love, outside, beyond the reinforced walls. Virella 3 remained as harsh and unforgiving as ever, its purple landscape frozen and barren. But inside, life flourished, not because of protocols or directives, but because of the human heart's capacity for compassion, for sacrifice, for seeing value in others when systems and algorithms saw only metrics and categories. As Stu made his way down to join his family in the fields, he thought about Mari's desperate words that first day. "My children are hungry. I'll work your fields, warm your bed. Just feed my starving kids." She had offered everything she had, expecting nothing more than bare survival in return. Instead, she had found something none of them had dared to hope for on this remote outpost: a future. And as Lena ran to meet him, her sample container clutched proudly in her hands, Yari following close behind with his careful documentation tablet. Stu knew that he had found the same, not just purpose or company, but belonging, the most essential human need of all. Behind them, Mari straightened from her work, brushing soil from her hands as she watched her children with Stu. When she smiled, the last traces of the desperate woman from the wastelands were gone, replaced by someone who had reclaimed not just her professional identity, but her hope. "Look what we found! Dr. Stu!" Lena called, holding up her container. Inside, a tiny vinhorn sprout had pushed through the soil on its own, without human planting or tending, the first sign that their careful work was creating a truly sustainable ecosystem. "Life finds a way," Stu murmured, kneeling beside the children to examine their discovery. "Even here?" Yari asked, his young voice serious as he recorded the finding in his tablet. Stu looked around at their thriving biodome, at the family he had found when he dared to open a door that should have remained closed, at the home they had created together against all odds and regulations. "Especially here," he answered, and knew it was true.